Hi, everyone. Welcome to anyone who's watching and listening to this conversation. This is a pre-recorded conversation between Advaya, myself, Tammy, and Hannah Close, who is the host and curator of KINSHIP, our upcoming course in 2023, a continuation of the same course, but a different theme that happened in 2022. Also called KINSHIP, which some of you might be familiar with. Today, we're just going to be unpacking a few of the themes and the core questions and topics that are key to the new KINSHIP course. And hopefully through this conversation, you have a better sense of what the course is going to be an inquiry into, what you can expect if you want to participate on the course. Yeah, and just to say also, in case anyone who has stumbled upon this and doesn't know what KINSHIP is a 6-week live online course that will be starting on the 31st of January 2023. It is hosted by Advaya and curated by Hannah. And we will be talking about the course today, but just in short, the course is themed around the metaphor world as archipelago that we will be exploring in this conversation. And it is curated by Hannah. And I'll read Hannah's bio briefly. Hannah is a writer and photographer. She's a curator, the lead curator at Advaya. You might be familiar with her if you've attended any of our courses before, especially KINSHIP from earlier this year and our ongoing course, Ecology of Love, with Dr. Andreas Weber. And she is currently studying engaged ecology at Schumacher College and is currently making a very relevant documentary called Islandness in the Anthropocene, which she will tell us a bit about, I'm sure. But yeah, I'm really excited to have this conversation and to be picking apart a lot of the themes of the course.
I'm just really excited. Happy to go straight into the questions.
Amazing. Okay, so we will get started with all the questions. The first one is, can you introduce the metaphor world as archipelago and what it means? Specifically, why you chose this metaphor and whose work this phrase riffs off of, and what bodies of work it engages with academically, theoretically, practically, and maybe share some of the speakers or some of the philosophers and thinkers and people that you've been inspired by when putting this course together.
Sure. So the world as archipelago metaphor is something that kind of has been influenced by various kind of scholars and artists who I'll mention shortly, but just to kind of unpack the metaphor itself. So there have been loads of different metaphors used to try and describe the inherent unity of human civilization across the planet. And they've all been quite well-meaning, but they haven't quite covered various different bases that I think are really important to cover when it comes to looking at the ways in which we are interconnected. So the world as archipelago metaphor, for me at least, is a way of seeing our interconnected nature in a different, more complex and more nuanced way than other metaphors might allow us to see. So for example, I think it was lifeboat Earth or a life raft Earth, spaceship Earth, and global village are some really common metaphors used in the kind of social change world to illustrate our interconnectedness. But those metaphors are, they kind of situate us outside of the ecosystem still. Especially the lifeboat and the spaceship are kind of, you know, we're inside these fragile vessels on top of the earth. We're not embedded within the earth on the land. Whereas the world as archipelago metaphor kind of situates us on the ground, basically. So yeah, I thought it would be an interesting metaphor to explore. It helps us understand the ways in which our connections are also separations, which I can elaborate a bit on later. But it's unlike the global village metaphor, which unifies us in one space, which is of course like a well-intentioned thing, and it's a lovely neighborly kind of feeling to be in a global village. It doesn't acknowledge our separations. And I think, you know, in the world of ecology and social change, I feel like there's an aversion to the possibility of separation. But as you know from my work with Andreas as well, I'm actually advocating for the view that our separations are also our connections. We just need to better understand and appreciate how and why. You know, in the case of the world as archipelago metaphor, what separates us is the ocean. But you know, the ocean's a connecting force as well. So there are so many like layers and nuances to this to unpack. And it's really open for interpretation. It's what's different about this year's kinship course compared to last year's is that I've invited the teachers to respond to the metaphor as broadly and as creatively and as wildly as they want to. It's really a like a creative prompt rather than a this is how the world is. So yeah, that's the kind of rationale behind using that metaphor. And in terms of where it comes from and who I've been influenced by, gosh, there are so many people. So behind this, there is my own experience of islandness, which is very limited. And also I've been reading the Tongan and Fijian anthropologist Epeli Hau'ofa, who has this great quote, which is, I can't remember it verbatim, but it was the Polynesians saw their world as a sea of islands, which I thought was beautiful. I've also been influenced by the French Caribbean philosopher Edouard Glissant. I know you've been reading Poetics of Relation as well. It's really hard, but it's so beautiful. And Glissant kind of advocated for what he called archipelagic thinking. And he also used this incredible metaphor in Poetics of Relation of if an island is like a root, like a singular root, then we need to learn how to be a rhizome. So like an archipelago of roots. And I think this is such an incredible and beautiful metaphor. And the root and the rhizome have so many parallels with the world as archipelago metaphor as well. Trying to think who else. I've been influenced by so many people. Kamal Brathwaite, sorry, he's the Barbadian poet who coined the term dialectics, which for me is kind of what it says on the tin, but I feel like it might be confusing for some people, and I'm still learning what it is on a deeper level. But if the kind of Western dominant mode of thinking is dialectics, which is like an oppositional debating way of generating knowledge and relation, high dialectics, like the tides, is much more flowing and receptive, and sometimes it's connected to land, and then other times it's kind of, you know, in the fluidity and wateriness of the ocean. So it's this really beautiful way of reimagining relation and relationship and ways of relating that kind of take on a both and perspective rather than like a rigid, singular, linear, hyper-rational perspective. Gosh, yeah, various other influences. You know, I recently read this incredible book by island scholars Jonathan Pugh and David Chandler called Anthropocene Islands, Entangled Worlds, which was utterly incredible. Donna Haraway, of course, is always in the list of influences. Andreas Weber, David White, So many, yeah.
There's a lot, I think, to unpack in that. Thank you for putting that all out. I don't know where to kind of hang on to that, but I think the big thing for me is, and we'll get into this a little bit later when we talk about separations and kinship, and about last year's course, but I think what's key is also reminding people that while like you said, the global village metaphor has such a well-meaning intention behind it, the homogenizing and sort of like flattening approach that it takes is very, like, leads to the issue of our like polarization, and the way that speaking about separation and difference has become sort of taboo, and people don't really know kind of like how to approach it in a way that's like quote unquote correct. There suddenly is like a right way and wrong way to approach difference, instead of kind of a real and authentic acknowledgement that we are different and we are, like you said, like connected in our separation. So I wanted to say that first. And then, yeah, and then I guess also to speak to, I guess, that last point about dialectics. Actually, that's the first time I've heard it explained, because I've only been reading about it. Haven't had time to go and dig into dialectics, but that makes a lot of sense. So the idea of, I guess, like understanding and relating in ways that allow for change and like being in flux, rather than it being a binary kind of approach, which I think, so this like dialectics seem to offer a very like good way to sum up and describe like how advaya approaches how we want people to be thinking, or not that we want to like tell people how to think, but I think like trying to find ways to, and vocabularies to describe the way that we want people to be like relating to each other and producing knowledge and recreating. I guess we never really are creating knowledge, but recreating knowledge and having those conversations. I wanted to, just to wrap on that question, invite you to talk about your research into islandness and to your documentary, which I know was like definitely like it's all kind of influencing each other, but wondering like how your interests or your research interest kind of comes into this course, or how that feeds into that, you know.
Yeah, it's a good question, because it's kind of for someone kind of not understanding or just encountering this morass of islandness for the first time, it might just look like a lot of islands obsessions, which is partially true because islands are fascinating, but there's also a kind of logical and intuitive reason for me why islandness, and all of the real and metaphorical issues that spill out of them are important right now and relevant, particularly relevant to the topic of kinship, and just relevant overall to the, you know, the various crises that we face that are all meeting at a confluence. And everything I've kind of learned and encountered over the past 2 or 3 years, especially through studying engaged ecology at Schumacher College, has led me to islands as real kind of embodied, grounded physical places in which all of my inquiries about relationship over the past few years have found ground. And I mean, that's not new. Islands have always been, you know, an obsession in anthropology and ecology, and there are some really thorny issues around this as well. But they've been at the center of, you know, the Western imagination forever. There's an official term for it, which is just islomania, you know, that to highlight this kind of obsession with it. But yeah, the kind of the confluence is that, well, with the documentary, it stems from a research question. So originally it was my master's thesis inquiry, and it stems from a research question, which was how, if at all, do islands, island ways, islandness, island life, islanders, whatever term you want to use, amplify relational entanglements? And what does this mean? And in which ways? And what can this teach us? So my own experience of islands is, as I said, limited, but every time I have experienced, and technically, I live on the British Isles, but I don't consider myself an islander. So there's so many interesting questions around what is an island, but we can get to that later. Yeah, the confluence basically comes around, islands and relational entanglements. And because islands are more, not all of the time, but they're more explicitly contained than mainlands, lots of interesting things arise out of this. The way communities are formed is different. So just speaking personally from my experience of the Hebridean Islands in Scotland, which is what I'm basing the documentary on, my experience there was that communities are bound to place, to physical place. They're not just bound by conceptual abstractions. They're not just bound by ideologies. They're not just bound by culture either. They're really, if there's a storm or something like this, people really depend on each other. And so interdependence is explicit. It's not just a nice idea that's sort of spoken about. It's you have to learn to get along with people that you don't necessarily like. Donna Haraway has this great word, oddkin. She uses oddkin to describe, you've got godkin, which are your kind of, blood family, and then you've got oddkin, which aren't, but that also extends out to people you don't like. And I feel islanders, they're not perfect magical beings either. They don't necessarily have the answer. It's not about romanticizing them, but they are put into positions that provoke relationships of a totally different kind to mainlanders. This is a really long, sprawling answer to your question.
No,
but there
it's
is
a good answer.
Yeah, like the whole inquiry just opens up so much, because it's not just about islands, right? It's about all of the things that islands can provoke, about identity, belonging, community, indigeneity, all of the very obvious stuff about climate collapse, rising sea levels, resource depletion, marine ecosystem damage. So much stuff to grapple with.
Yeah. And I think it's personally like an interesting inquiry for me too, as someone who's like technically also brought up on an island, but probably arguably one of the islands in the world. For context, Singapore, in case anyone else doesn't know, don't expect anyone to know. It's a tiny little island. Doesn't really count as I don't think it really counts as an island, because it's been built in such a way that if anyone has ever traveled to Singapore, it's very not islandy. It doesn't feel like an island at all, especially if you're traveling within the region. Southeast Asia, everything else feels more quote unquote islandy, which is also something to be questioned. But I think that puts that also just opens up a whole series of questions, right? Because I come from and have been raised on an island that is in a region of islands, but is also like built, and thus I relate very differently with other people who I like share a place with, and our relation as a nation state to other nations within this island region is a very tricky relationship. So to say that I think the inquiry in islands is so rich also because there's so many layers of so many like different cultural, social, geological forces, political forces that kind of interplay in this inquiry. And every island understandably, and every collection of islands is different, and every relationship between islands is different. So I can, and it's a difficult one for me to talk about also because I feel like unqualified as a person who, like, even though I come from technically an island, like I feel unqualified to talk about it, even though, yeah, and I think that comes back to the issue of like how we've been taught to, or like socialized into talking about difference and talking about like power and relations between each other. But anyway, just another ramble.
I feel the same, you know, as I said, I'm right now I'm in the British Isles. You know, technically the UK is some kind of archipelago because you've got, you know, Ireland and you've got various outlying islands as well. And after Brexit, suddenly this nation became aware of itself as an island in a way that it hadn't before. And there are so many interesting and like relevant and thorny geopolitical issues that come out of this, because since the UK left Europe, it's changed everything. It's changed everything. You know, and it's talking about what is an island. It's such a debated issue. I mean, there are over, I think it's 900,000 official islands in the world, but there are millions of actual islands, you know, and we're talking rocks in the sea to technically the largest island officially is Greenland. But I have friends in Australia who consider Australia to be an island, you know, officially it's a continent. So it's like it was the first thing I tried to understand when I set out on this research. It sounded like a stupid question. What is an island? Of course I know what an island is. Like, actually, I don't. And I speak to islanders and they can't quite define it either. And so it's this really nebulous, you know, John Gillis calls them, you know, liminal spaces and liminal geography. I think this is fascinating because islands are also disappearing. Does that mean they don't exist anymore? You know, as soon as they go underneath the surface of the ocean, they're also appearing. You know, volcanic eruptions are creating new islands. So it's utterly fascinating. And given how many islands there are in the world, they're not peripheral, far away places that, you know, only exist in tropical locations for fun holidays. This is absolutely not the case. Yeah. They make up an incredibly large amount of the world's landmass, population, and like cultural production. And
yeah, actually I think this might be a good opportunity to skip ahead to, and we'll come back to the kinship question, but I think it makes some more sense to skip ahead to the question on islands, specifically since we're already talking about kind of the fascination with and I guess we would say like fetishization of islands, romanticization of islands, especially with climate change discourse becoming more and more mainstream, which is good and bad thing. I guess overall it has to be a good thing, but the way it's coming into the mainstream, as the focus on islands will show, the way it comes into the mainstream is important to recognize also. And so with the climate crisis, and I guess not as a context, but not necessarily to focus on it, but more to say that like islanders' perspectives are becoming more and more relevant. I think within the last few decades, the perspectives of islanders and islanders themselves have been more, I guess, like centered in the past few years, but also at the same time, as you know and have like researched about, they are constantly being left out still, even though, and that's what happens when I guess you tokenize islanders, which is a real problem. So could you kind of speak to all of these like thorny parts and and talk to us about why this inquiry, why host it and yeah, why you, I guess, also. Lots to go into there, but yeah.
So it's, I mean, so one thing again, I guess I should just reiterate is that I'm not, I don't want to claim to speak on behalf of islanders, which is why it's so exciting that the faculty of the course is made up from so many islanders from all across the world. We've got people from Greenland, the Philippines, Fiji, we've got the Hebrides, it's such an exciting array of voices coming into the fold. So I'm really excited about that. And on the kind of climate mainstreaming conversation of, and the kind of, how islands have come in and out of our consciousness culturally, collectively, it's a really interesting one, because on the one hand, they get featured heavily, but in a very romanticized way. Like, oh wow, these are some faraway mystical places that must be protected. And then, the other strand of that perspective is it sets up this rescuer dynamic, which can become very colonial and very extractive very quickly, and doesn't take into account the level of resilience that islands all across the world display. Because while they are some of the first places in the world to be affected by climate change, obvious things as well, like sea level rise is a particularly difficult one. On the other hand, they are profoundly resilient in the face of this because of the strength of their community, because of the connection to the land, and various other things. So it seems to be a challenge of navigating this, of sort of not coming in, either as mainlanders or as Western countries and saying, we'll rescue you, because islanders used to be painted as savages as well. Like it's a really, and that's still kind of haunting the Western imaginary around islands too. I mean, especially with things like Robinson Crusoe, if you look at a lot of the, which is profoundly racist, there's like loads of texts and things that deepen this image of islands as fragile and full of people who don't know what they're doing, basically, and they need the Western troop to come in with Christianity and so on to redeem them. So there's that. And then you've got the kind of lens of anthropology and of climate scientists basically seeing that, yes, there is something interesting and unique about islands, especially in the Anthropocene. What is that? And so much interesting scholarship and kind of art and cultural production have come out of the interactions between these, for want of a better word, outsiders and the islanders and the islands themselves. But at the same time, again, this extractive behavior goes on where people go to islands, take what they want, do their research, exploit the people, and then leave. And this is why it's really important to understand, islands are fantastic metaphors, but they're also real places with real people. Two of the popular metaphors that are used for islands at the moment in relation to climate change and other sort of issues, ongoing issues, are the canary in the coal mine. That islands, what happens on islands signals what's going to happen to the rest of the world. And then there's also another one. Oh, the islands are a microcosm of the macrocosm. So similar sort of thing, that if we pay attention to islands now and we can see the unfolding effects of climate change and other things, that we can prepare ahead of time. But again, this is, this can very easily turn into a view of islands as like an allegorical warning sign and not much else.
Can I just say, it's also just very weirdly sacrificial, and for what reason? This idea that also just not people using islands and islanders as a case study and as like a moral lesson for the rest of the world that is more privileged to not experience climate change and its worst effects. Yeah, very strange and colonial behavior going on.
Yeah, yeah, it's very while it is the case that a lot of what happens on islands will eventually make its way to the mainlands, it's also, there are issues that are unique to islands and unique to islands only, that need to be addressed. And it's not, you know, in a culture of individualism, it's not in mainlanders' economic interest to help islands on particularly unglamorous issues like fuel poverty, and also, you know, think like cultural erosion, the way in which islanders' cultures are being slowly eroded by, you know, I don't know the correct term, but like maybe neo-colonial influence, which is still ongoing, and the influence of capitalism, you know, which raises another really interesting issue of and maybe we won't go into it, but just to raise it, the islands are like inherently, there's an inherent kind of osmosis and intersplicing of cultures when it comes to islands, because they often rely on the ocean and you know, sailing to get from island to island, which is how cultures become exchanged and how they sort of evolve and develop and influence each other, which can be an incredible kind of like ecologically aligned, beautiful process of growth and co-learning and collaboration. And then it can very quickly turn into the erosion of cultures. Like if a culture loses too much of its integrity, too much of its roots, if, you know, especially if a culture starts to lose its language and mythology through the influence of other cultures, then it becomes really problematic. So the challenge is like, how do we maintain our mobility and our relations across borders without just homogenizing everything and flattening everything? I mean, it's a big question.
Yeah, and I think this is where it gets into like the very like, I don't want to be like it's an age-old debate, but it is kind of a question that's been asked a lot. And I'm also thinking, just because we've been reading Glissant, right? And his whole thing about how he approaches globalization and how that sort of root and relation identity, I think, are very key to this particular question. And I'm sure we'll get into it when we have the speakers, also the teachers, also share about their experiences, and I'm sure like participants will get the chance to ask about those questions about cultural erosion and how, and not necessarily to help, but to just also amplify the situation. And because I think sometimes it's people have this, and this is sidetracking a little bit, but people have this tendency to want to help and save islanders, which you also talked about. But sometimes it's really just about like listening and amplifying, especially because so many of these like island like issues, like you said, are very, they can be very specific to where they're from and the people that they affect. And so we don't necessarily have to listen with an intention of doing anything particularly, because that wanting to do something is sometimes also just more harmful. And so I think maybe it's a good opportunity to jump back to the question about kinship, which is the course title. I think we at Advaya like have been talking about this quite frequently, about why we use the word kinship rather than relationship, rather than community, and rather than, or in conjunction with togetherness. And I wondered if you could share that with people who have never come across the term before, and why it's an important way to reframe how we think about relationships, and also how to kind of approach it in a way that doesn't like just find a new buzzword and overuse it like we've done with community. So yeah.
Yeah, and collaboration and embodiment. I mean, there are so many of these now, right? So, I mean, I don't have, same with, the question, what is an island? What is kinship? I don't have, nor do I claim to have the kind of definition of it, but, it means so many different things to so many different people. My personal experience of it was admittedly from the environmental humanities, ecology kind of world, where it's very on vogue at the moment, especially in anthropology, and it's extending beyond that. But my basic understanding of it is that it's like a kind of system of relationships, and the word system can sound maybe a bit mechanistic or methodical. So, that's open for interpretation. But from a Western frame, the word kinship seems to mean two things. One, the very obvious meaning of your bloodline, your genealogy, your lineage, who are your family, what Haraway would call godkin. And then you have the second understanding, which is how Indigenous people, how Indigenous societies arrange their networks according to these kinship relationships, and not just within the human community, but also within the more than human community. So from a Western frame, those are the two sort of like dominant understandings of the word. But, again, referring back to Haraway, I really love this idea of oddkin. I love this idea that kinship is not sort of neatly contained in a box, and that we have to learn to expand these conventional definitions of kinship, so that we include people that we might not necessarily like, so that we include the more than human. So yeah, it's quite a broad one, and it's quite hard to sort of pin down, and it's not meant to be pinned down, I suppose, and it's certainly not something that we can point at. Like we can't buy it. Many people do try to buy their way into relationships in Western capitalism, but it's something to me that seems to operate in the spaces in between. Like it's not like you can't point at a person and say that person has kinship. It's really the kind of magic, the yoke that brings people together. And it's also differentiating kinship from relationship. So relationship, I could say, I have a relationship with the chair I'm sitting on right now. That's technically speaking a relationship. I don't feel like I have kinship with the chair. Or maybe I do. It supports me, it gives me comfort. That's good. I'm not sure what I'm giving back to the chair, but kinship is a particular form of relationship that is explicitly reciprocal. It's bound in a logic of exchange. It's not just extractive, because so many relationships are extractive, and I mean so many people will be familiar with this. So I think that's what differentiates kinship from relationship in particular. I'm still learning.
Yeah, I think it's that was a good attempt at like summarizing the ideas behind using the word kinship. And I think just to also plug that there are a bunch of like little clips of the past kinship course for anyone who wants to go into that. Specifically, I'm thinking of we had a session with Tim Ingold, I think, when he talked about if people are interested in the parallels between like kinship or how kinship converses with the idea of like ancestry and lineage, that sort of thing. Yeah, and of course, like exploring the different ways of like kinship and kinning and the practice of it.
Gavin Van Horn talks a lot about kinning as well, and I'm thinking of Sophie Strand too. A new metaphor just came into my head actually while he was speaking about kinship, which was, if you've kind of, so the word ecology itself has also becoming more and more popular recently. And it used to mean, you know, scientific kind of biology, and now it means something completely different. To me, it means a system of living relationships. And the root, the etymology of the word ecology comes from the Greek oikos, which means home. So if I were to, you know, hazard a guess at a definition for kinship, again, this is just, you know, an intellectual exercise. If ecology means home and is the system of living relationships, kinship is like the foundation of that home. It's like the very basis, the very infrastructure of that home. And then if you think about the difference between a house and a home, you know, what makes a house a home versus what makes a relationship and what makes kinship, I feel like there's a couple of parallels that can be drawn between those two things. Yeah, and you know, something that Gavin also speaks about a lot is that kinship is a verb. You know, it's a practice. It's not an object. It's not just a concept. It's a way of doing things. It's a way of being.
Yeah, and I think like I don't know if this is if this is somewhat related, but I'm just now Python's young reporters talk. It just popped into my head. It was a very slap in the face kind of reminder that like kinship is not a process, or it's not a practice that we can afford to be romanticizing in the way that we've romanticized like community. And I think the idea of kinship is also special because it talks in the same way that we are trying to approach the way we think about islands. It's like connections and separations, right? Like difference and sameness, and trying to have a nuanced approach to relationship in a way that's like, it's not always going to be like the relationships between us aren't always going to be good and beautiful and romantic. It's sometimes also difficult, but that's what like kinship is about. It's like negotiating that when it is difficult, when it is tricky, and when it gets to that point, then I think that's where the inquiry and the practice of it becomes actually useful and like decolonial also, right?
Yeah, totally. And it's really, you know, it's important just to reiterate that last year's kinship course was very broad. It was very much about opening up lots of doors and just exploring kinship in general. Whereas this year's kinship course is still very much about those core themes we were exploring last year, but this time we're grounding it in a real place with real people. You know, this time we're reducing the number of doors that we're opening and trying to go deeper and to make it make sense in the context of these very real places that are these questions around kinship are just, you know, bubbling out of constantly at the moment. So yeah, it feels like a really kind of fertile ground from which to ask these questions about kinship and relationship and what it really means on a deeper level.
Andreas specifically has written quite theoretically, but it does help us like narrow things down a little bit, talking about our relationships. And this is, again, just kind of on the same thread that we've been trying to pull, I think, with this conversation, where he writes that our relationships, when they succeed, are constant celebrations of this connection and separation. So connection and separation is hyphenated into one word. So I wanted to ask you, from your perspective, what it means to you, and specifically with this course, talking about islands, inevitably the question of borders come up, and you mentioned that there are like real and imagined borders, and how can this sort of separation, thinking about borders, can be a sort of enlivening thing or process.
Yeah. I mean, it's a really interesting question, or set of questions, because there are so, and it's really difficult because there are so many like contradictions and paradoxes in this that can like very quickly become, you know, intellectually abstract and challenging. But paradox is something we have to grapple with and get better at grappling with as a species. And I feel that, you know, particularly with the islands example, so, you know, using a real world example, the ocean separates us. Like, so right now, you and I, you know, you're in Singapore, I'm in the UK. I'm like, okay, how do I get to Tammy? I'm not going to swim, you know, I'm not going to swim to Singapore. Say if all of the flights were grounded, there were no ships or whatever, and I was trying to figure out how to traverse this kind of chasm, physical chasm between us. It would feel very separated on the one hand, but then we're also connected, you know, the same. If I go and put my hand in the, you know, in the ocean, I'm very fortunate enough to live very nearby. At some point, that ocean is going to touch the shore of your place, you know, and then we're on the computer right now speaking to each other, so we're separated but we're also connected. Like, there are so many ways in which we're separated and connected. Yeah, so that's like, I don't know if that example makes sense. You know, there's also, I don't want to get too philosophical about it, but in order for a relationship to form, there needs to be two or more agents in that relationship to make it happen, and then you kind of get like the third entity out of it, which, you know, I'm not going to make an attempt at saying what that is, but islands really invite us to play with this metaphor because they are full of shorelines and thresholds and points of osmosis, which can be considered at the same time points of separation, you know, physical lines in the landscape, and points of connection as well. I'm trying to think of another example of how I can be both connected and separated to somewhere that feels far away. Like, if I, you know, one example is if I throw away plastic into the ocean and it ends up on a beach on the other side of the world, my influence, you know, completely unknown to me, is having an impact on this place that I feel separated from, really far away. Like, the rubbish that I have discarded is now killing marine life on the other side of the world, for example. It's not a very, you know, wholesome example, but it's a way in which something that I think I'm separated from intellectually, conceptually, because it feels so abstract, I'm actually completely connected to. This is why it's important for you know, mainlanders to recognize that what they're doing on mainlands is having an impact on islands. It's not this vast ocean space that is this giant void, you know, faceless void. It's just a space of interval that's separating us. It's kind of like a connecting glue rather than a separating chasm, depending on how you look at it. Yeah, I don't know if that helps sort of explain that a little bit. It's quite complex when you get into it.
I think it's a complex, like a lot of things that we discuss. Like, I think it's just because it's complex doesn't mean it's not grounded. I think people often assume that complex ideas are like necessarily ungrounded ideas. These are very like, I think, real material ideas, and specifically just thinking about the plastic one, which is somewhat sometimes an overused example in that I think people don't actually think about it anymore. Like it's one of those things that's kind of like, even though it's crazy how embedded plastic is in like everything, it's become almost like in the background because it's spoken about so much. I think it's interesting to think about. So I'm thinking specifically about this one person who Heather Davis, who talks about plastics and the materiality of it. I think the study of materiality is a really interesting kind of space to go into if you want to like be kind of geek out about this, thinking about things being embedded in other things and kind of finding like kinship, thinking about kinship in those ways, in very material ways. And plastic is a very useful metaphor and material to think with when we think about that, also because you then like entangle with the world of like fossil fuels and like Heather talks about like petro time. So lots of things in that very rich space to think about, but I don't want to get too like distracted by that idea. But yeah, as in to say that I think it's all very real. And I'm now also thinking about, for some reason, thinking about whales, because like I think, and maybe this is because one of the teachers on our course is going to be sharing about whales. But just thinking about thinking with whales as a animal that in which like a lot of our like deposits are like accumulated in and then kind of come back to us in a very circular way. So yeah, anyway, just
It's really interesting, and so many kind of thoughts and feelings are popping into my head about this. And just thinking about, I'm thinking about the way in which things travel to places that they aren't supposed to be. And this navigating this tension between rootedness and adriftness. And I think of a whale and I think of how far, thousands of miles that a whale will travel, or any kind of marine creature that, might have a piece of plastic that has, attached itself to them, and they will carry that with them across the globe. And it'll end up, that creature might end up dying, and that piece of plastic will end up somewhere kind of alien. And I remember the experience of being in Mexico a long time ago and walking along this otherwise, paradise-like beach, and just seeing brands not from that country, like labels on bottles and things that were from like the UK or somewhere. Like, I know this brand doesn't exist in this country, and it's just this weird feeling of like, this is not the kind of osmosis that we want. This is not the kind of mobility that we want. And just that feeling of connection to place, and like how I wrote something on Instagram recently from the same trip in Mexico of like how my humanness can relate to palm trees, but my cultural imaginary can't, because the palm tree doesn't make as much sense to me personally as say an oak tree. And again, it's like, this isn't a very linear point, but it's just grappling with this kind of what belongs where, what feels at home where, what can travel where, like who gets to decide, and how does it make sense, and who does it make sense to? Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think this is not at all a linear conversation. I don't think it's supposed to be anyway. And I think it's best when it's non-linear. But to kind of hold on to that thought of, I think it's a good question to ask. I think it might even be a good core question, like what is the kind of osmosis that we want to see? I think that's a big like question that the course will probably like get into. And to kind of go back to the random questions that the second random question that I have, which is a quote that that you and a writer that you've been talking about, John Gillis, who writes that we can, I use the word use, but now I kind of regret it. So use islands as quote, as thresholds to other worlds and new lives, end quote. And so in this context, as we've been thinking with a lot of different things in this conversation, I wanted to ask you, what can thinking with islands offer us, and why? I think in a very real, and maybe also if you want to share like a personal way, like, and if you've been sharing already, but if you want to share anything more, why should we engage and like be present with this inquiry right now with islands? Yeah.
So if I can somehow link that to your first question, so why islands, what can they offer us? Also, what can we give back? What can they help us understand? And then your first question about what kind of osmosis do we want? I'm trying to loop that back, because I think that what islands can offer us is a way in which to ask that question. Well, what kind of osmosis do we want? And I don't even know if osmosis is the right word. Like, I don't know if that's a word that many people understand, but what kind of intersplicing, what kind of cultural, ecological cross-pollination, interacting and ultimately relating is healthy and we do want to encourage. And this question raises an interesting point about globalization, because I have this vague memory of globalization initially being this narrative of interconnectedness. And yay, we're all unified and this is great. Yay, globalization means a good thing, right? This is the kind of osmosis that we want. And now it's like, no, globalization is a fracturing force. It's not a connecting force, despite what the initial kind of mythology around it might have been. And so it's a question of, yeah, how do we remain mobile? How do we continue to travel, to exchange, to combine, cultural practices in ways that benefit not only both communities and both cultures, but particularly the one that is being that is hosting the other culture? Like, how do we make sure that when we are on that particular land, engaging with that particular community, that we are not there just to, seek answers? And islands in particular, and I'm guilty of this myself, attract seekers. They attract people looking for answers, looking for community, looking for belonging, for all of these things that we're kind of grappling with in the course. And then the question is, well, what can we give back? And again, nuanced issue, because that can also very quickly turn into a performance of altruism, and I am the savior coming in to give you aid, and I'm bringing you gifts, and look at me, I'm so good, kind of thing. So the kind of osmosis I think we need to encourage. And actually, it's funny you mentioned Tyson Porter, because I remember something from his talk last year. He said, you won't find the answers in Indigenous communities, but you'll find the answers in dialogue with Indigenous communities. And I think that's such a key point. Like, also, I don't believe in the answers, but whatever we're looking for, or the way towards flourishing, let's say, will be in dialogue with islands, in dialogue with Indigenous communities and communities that aren't Indigenous, just in dialogue, in, you know, in a way that has the spirit of Thai dialectics, not Western dialectics at its core, and having conversations rather than following a method into relation, but just having that kind of, you know, like the tides, having that give and take in the kind of dialogue that I'm having with these people and with these places. So yeah, and then to kind of draw that to the second question, if I can, what can we kind of learn from islands in terms of, you know, islands can inspire us, and they can provoke us, and they can kind of put us into questioning things around borders, what that means, around thresholds, around, you know, things like cultural authenticity, indigeneity. There are too many things to kind of list. I mean, I obviously have a very personal connection to this topic just because of what I personally have received when traveling to islands. Has given me so much meaning and has affected me so much, obviously, because I'm now only talking about islands all the time. Yeah, I feel like the islands have given me ground for what has for a long time remained an abstract thing, like kinship, like belonging, like community, like cultural rootedness. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question in any way whatsoever.
No, it answers it. I think it like it answered it in different ways, and I'm just now thinking about like there are many more entry points to this course than I initially thought. And it seems like a much more, I mean, now that I don't know if you feel the same way, but I feel like now that, maybe also for me, because I haven't thought about it as much, but now that I've like unpicked it a little bit, I feel more like it's an accessible inquiry. It feels more like there are many different like touch points, because there are so many like different like spaces that we're interacting with, like materiality, globalization, identity, borders, and specifically, I think about like the idea of like borders is a very touchy like political topic right now, also because of the way that people are being displaced willingly and unwillingly, and this idea of, I'm going to try and like phrase it in a way that makes sense. It might not sound correct, but I'll try to make sense of it. I think thinking about borders in the very like geopolitical way, and in the way that like the news would report it, in the way that like political commentators like talk about borders, is very and talk about how like the crises around borders are being spoken about, is a very like unsustainable, and not to overuse the word, but colonial way of thinking about borders and identities, and I guess like solving and healing crises. And all of this is to say that I think thinking with islands will hopefully like open up a way to, at least for me, it's like opening up a way to think about borders, real borders and imagined borders, in a way that's not wrapped up in that very problematic approach, I think. And that's also part of the reason why I think I find it hard to engage in that discourse. So thinking with islands, I think, is a very useful like framework to approach this. Yeah, and also I I think the topic of diasporas and diasporic identities is always very like prominent question. And it's a question that I think a lot of younger people also think about a lot, especially with I think thinking about the generational like kind of approaches to islands is also an interesting thing, like how the way we think about islands has changed over time. That's, I'm sure, something we'll do in the course.
So on the borders thing, you know, islands are their borders are so explicit, unlike mainland borders, because they're literally their perimeter is determined by the ocean, which is not an ideological, geopolitical, at least in the first instance, force. It is a wild, elemental, powerful, it can kill you really quickly force. That border is very explicit. And then on the other hand, you've got the fact that islands are inherently connected to and mobile and in conversation with other islands. And so you've got this very real reminder of the border, and then this invitation to travel across it. And then on mainlands, borders are much more nebulous in some ways and not in others, but the geography, the topography of a place is not just a biological, physical phenomena. It's very much a geopolitical one as well, and vice versa. So that connection between culture and place becomes even more explicit. And then you mentioned diaspora, which is another, core topic that's going to be discussed in the course as well. And, one of the big influences actually that I didn't mention earlier was Paul Gilroy, who kind of pioneered the whole school of thought around the Black Atlantic and creolization, and how a new kind of diasporic civilization emerged during the period of slavery, between British, Caribbean, French, and other cultures, that is now a standalone culture in and of itself. And I find that, again, it all comes back to metaphors ultimately. The metaphor of diaspora is like a spore, like a mushroom spore that just spreads itself out far and wide. And it raises so many interesting questions around, like, where do people truly belong, and what does indigeneity like really mean? Does it mean you've stayed in the same place forever and you've built that kind of intimacy with it, or does it mean something else? Like, some of my Jewish friends will talk about that their rootedness is in their wandering, is in their moving from place to place, what Glissant would call their errantry, which completely challenges the idea of belonging and like belonging in place and being indigenous to place. It's like, what are you indigenous to? It doesn't necessarily have to be a place. So I find this endlessly fascinating. And again, it's not an either or, it's a kind of both and tension to navigate. Like, how can we, one of the core questions in my life and that I keep asking in kinship is, how can we belong in fragments? Because in the West, there's this idea that belonging has to be whole and pure, and somehow complete for it to be valid. But when most of the world is, I would argue, I mean, this is just a bit of a shot in the dark, but most of the world is diasporic to some extent. You can meet people that have been living in a community for like, they can trace their family back a couple of 100 years, and then you find out that they traveled and they came from there. And so it's like, promiscuous is the wrong word, but human civilization has like promiscuously traveled all across the globe for the whole of history. Obviously, that very quickly can collapse into colonialism, but there are other ways that we can maintain this moving from place to place without bulldozing other cultures. So it's just like, again, how do we have both of these things? How do we navigate this? How do we stay rooted and adrift in our rootedness and rooted in our adriftness, if that makes sense?
Yeah, and I think that's a good place to invite you to share about, because now I'm just thinking, because you basically almost just said like Lenny's talk title, session title, in what you were just saying. So inviting you to share about like a few of the sessions or a few of the teachers that you're specifically interested or excited about, and not to like pick favorites, but to also like give people a sense of like what they can expect, and the kind of different places that we will be exploring and mapping together.
Yeah, so the I mean, as you'll see from the website, not all of the talk descriptions are in yet, but that's quite exciting because, as I said earlier, like unlike last year's kinship course where it was a very structured journey from here to A to B, this year I've invited the speakers to kind of be prompted by this metaphor, and so where we'll be going with them will be very much a mystery, which is really exciting, and it will be really generative. And we've got, I think it's 12 teachers this year from islands all over the world. Craig is from Guam, Ian lives on Skye, Lenny's in the Philippines, David was originally from Ireland, we've got Maureen from Fiji, Alistair's in the Hebrides as well. It's so exciting. So yeah, the goal is to kind of also get away with the curation of this lineup as well, is to get away from this singular idea of islandness that might happen if we just kind of had one type of person from one island talking about it, and to instead really speak to this diversity and like multiplicity of islandness by having lots of different speakers, bringing incredibly diverse perspectives. So for example, David Gange, who we recently added to the lineup, has his kind of perspective based out of, kayaking the coastlines of England, which is a really unique perspective on islandness. It's a way of engaging kind of from the outside. I'm personally fascinated with sailing as well. I find it really interesting to encounter the land from not the land. And then you've got Craig, who's kind of coming in with the experience of the poetic and making sense of it through that way. And yeah, there's just so many different approaches and expertise coming from our speakers this year. So really excited.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say also, like, Himali, speaking from the perspective of an artist and having been to the poles, like that's crazy.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and it's really exciting to have a mix of kind of academics and artists and writers and scholars, and also people that are on the ground, involved in kind of grassroots activism as well, and like really enacting real change in their communities. So it's it's like an unlikely motley crew. Like when I kind of look at everybody who we've gathered together, I'm like, when would we ever get to experience this, all of these voices in the same room? And that feels really exciting, and it feels really generative. Like I think the connections we'll be able to make, and the kind of narrative we'll be able to weave through the sessions, will just, hopefully cause us to think differently and have a different perspective. And I have no idea what to expect. Even though I've curated the thing, I'm like, what's going to happen? That's the joy of it. That's what's generative.
Yeah, and before we wrap, I also want to ask if you wanted to share about I think the mapping, like the exercises that you're thinking of engaging the participants in. I wonder if you have any like thoughts on how that's going to happen, what your intention is going into that?
So I have an intention, but I don't know how it's going to be executed yet. This idea of counter mapping. So most people know of counter mapping as a way in which Indigenous communities reclaim their understanding of their land away from like kind of this concept of state territory and state ownership, by essentially creating maps through their perspective and not through the perspective of control and economics and so on. So I'm curious about how people will sort of interpret this theme, and if there's a way that we could collectively create new maps that are based on relational pathways instead of, you know, the standard maps we see, you know, particularly coming out of Western culture that situate usually England right at the center, which is just, you know, the map, the world map that most people are familiar with is geographically wrong, but it's just taken as verbatim. And it also doesn't convey much about the reality of what we're seeing. And, you know, it's also important to mention that the map is not the territory, of course, and a map can be like used as an oppressive, logical, hyper-rational tool for containment and categorization. And on the flip side of that, it can also be quite a liberating tool, a way for people to make sense of their place, a way for people to make sense of their connection to others and other places and people. So I'm just curious to experiment with the idea of mapping, whether that's physically drawing maps or just having a conversation about it. But yeah, it's in its embryonic form at the moment. So if anybody knows any counter cartographers, come and say hello.
Amazing. Okay, and I think that's such a great way to wrap. Thank you, Hannah, for making time to answer all my questions and to put together this course. Very excited to see how it all comes together, especially as the first course of the new year. I think it's very exciting. After everyone has settled into the new year, we start on the 31st of January. Which seems far away now, but I think it'll just come right around right after New Year. So tickets are on sale now on the website kinship-course.com. If you go to kinship course without the dash, you'll go to the old website. So go to the new one with the dash. Yeah, we will be selling tickets right up to the beginning of the course. And if anyone wants to join past the first session, you can always join. All sessions are recorded and you'll have access to the recordings, the materials once you join. And there are, like always, concession prices as well as bursaries that are still open until it will be closed though a few days before the course starts, I think, or a week before the course starts. So to say if anyone requires financial support to apply for the bursaries. Other than that, yeah, can't wait for people to join. And Hannah, if you have any final words, I'll leave it to you.
Just want to say thank you, Tammy, for having such a great conversation with me. Yeah, and I'm just really excited, and yeah, it's a bit of a mystery to me still, but I'm curious to see where we all end up at the end of this. Based on last year's experience, it just grew of its own accord into what it wanted to be, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what this wants to be. So yeah, exciting times.